Yay, here we go. So we're going to talk about lipids now. Fats are our friends. So lipids, aka fats, are a very diverse group of molecules which are mostly nonpolar. So that remember the term nonpolar means they're going to have huge amounts of hydrocarbons in them. Nonpolar hydrocarbons don't like water, hence we use the term hydrophobic or water-fearing. Lipids are really important. They do a lot of things, including keep us warm, provide us with this long-term energy store in case we need it. They provide insulation, as you can see here, this cute little river otter. They serve as building blocks for very important hormones, and they're an extremely important part of our cellular membranes, and so we're going to see those. So the different ones, remember these don't have monomer units because you're going to see that in a minute. There's so many different types. But we're going to look at the fats, the oils, a little bit on waxes, phospholipids, and steroids. So let's get started. So fats are basically two things. They're made up of these long chains of hydrocarbons that are combined, that are joined with, if you look at the slide here, and you can see this, you might want to blow this up a little bit. This right here, here's our carboxylic acid group. So remember that carboxylic acid right here, carbon, double bonded oxygen, and an OH on this side. So this whole thing is the carboxylic acid. Hence, when it joins with in a group, which you're going to see here in a second, it joins specifically with something called glycerol. And look at glycerol, and you can see it has a 3-carbon little backbone here with a lot of hydroxyl groups here on the end. And so this is an alcohol. There's the OL ending, so this is alcohol. And when it joins with these fatty acids, it forms this thing, this fatty acid, it's going to form what's called a triacyl glycerol, sometimes called just a triglyceride. And that's so that glycerol, this one molecule of glycerol, is going to form, see where that H is on this one, and that OH on one of these fatty acid chains. You're going to have 3 of these joining, again, dehydration synthesis, and they're going to form this larger, very large structure called a triacyl glycerol or a triglyceride. 3 molecules of water are released. So for each one of these linkages here, you have 1 water molecule released. And in the end, we call this particular joining an ester linkage. So this is called an ester linkage. Now, why it's called an ester, you can go back and look at some of the other worksheets I gave you earlier, and I said, oh, well, we won't look at this too much until we get into some specifics. Look at where the bond occurred here. So what you have here, this is a part of that fatty acid chain right here, and notice that you have that last carbon still has the double bonded oxygen on it, and now it's this single oxygen here is joined in 2 places. So in effect, it's joined to the carbon, it's joined to this carbon. That's called an ester linkage. When that fatty acid, so remember, this is the hydrocarbon chain, and this is sort of the acidic part, so that's the carboxylic acid group. When this chain is straight, and notice that within this chain here, there are no double bonds, which means that their maximum number, so no double bonds within these carbon to carbons, maximum number of hydrogen possible that would be on this. We call that saturated. Now, saturated fats are ones that we think of as the solid fats, like butter and like bacon, grease, etc. That when it cools, it becomes quite solidified because because of these straight chains, because of this saturation, in other words, it's saturated by the maximum number of hydrogens, it can pack tightly. So that's why it can become like a solid. However, here's a however, when it has a double bond, they can't have these, it loses a couple hydrogen here, and therefore we call this an unsaturated fatty acid. So this is oleic acid that you would find, well, we'll talk about where you can find some of these fatty acids. So this is unsaturated fatty acid. If it has only one double bond, such as this guy, then it's called a monounsaturated fat. If it has multiple, then it's called a polyunsaturated fat. And because of this, and we're going to see this in the next slide, you can kind of think of this whole remember that cis-trans thing when we were looking at what happens across the double bond? Keep that one in mind when we looked at the isomers, when we're looking at isomers. Here we go. So if we have a double bond, here's a saturated fatty acid. So notice that it's not perfectly straight. Just notice the way these carbons are connecting to each other, but it's still all single bonds. So in this case, this thing called stearic acid is a saturated fat. But when we look at the unsaturated ones, and let's see if I can make this just a little bigger. I don't know how this is going to work when I'm doing this. Oh, that is better. All right, so on these unsaturated ones, where there's a double bond somewhere, look at the difference between the cis type and the trans type. So remember, these are the same chemical formula, but the question is, what groups are on the same side or on the opposite side of the double bond? So here you see that, and we'll follow here just the hydrogens. The hydrogens in this case are on the same side in this unsaturated fat, and so it causes a little kink to happen, a little bend in this chain, where in the trans fats, which can be created through processing that people do, what it does is it takes something that would normally be a liquid, would be an oil, and not be saturated, and basically makes it act like it's saturated, because it straightens out this molecule, so it's no longer has that kink in it. And you kind of see why, I think, if you look at that. So these trans fats are not good for us, because they can pack just like the saturated fats can in our bloodstream. You get to hear the lovely music in the background now. So I'm going to just go one more here. Well, a couple more. So here we go. So some fatty acids are really good for us. I mean, essentially, we want them in our diets. They're called essential fatty acids. And on this one, look at this line structure, so don't get thrown off. We could draw every single one of the carbons on here and the double bonds and whether or not they have, and what that looks like. So we know it's unsaturated because we already see double bonds. And what else we see is we see 3 double bonds here in this chain, which makes this very bent. And then at the very end, because this is a fatty acid, here's our C carbon with the double bonded oxygen that you can't see the double bond, and then the OH. This is the carboxylic acid functional group. There's omega-3 fatty acids, there's omega-6 fatty acids, and all of these are good for our hearts. They actually help to reduce our cholesterol level and help to reduce the possibility of heart attack. Let me go. Well, I think I have to go again. All right. There are also fats called, these things called, let's see if I can move this over, waxes. And you know what a wax is. So a wax is sometimes it's just a coating here on the leaf of this, on the surface of this leaf. Sometimes these waxes are useful in either helping things to not stick together or to prevent water from entering. You see them on the feathers of birds. So waxes are also under the category of lipids. And then something that we'll get into maybe a little detail on later, these same kinds of structures, these aren't waxes, these are different, but these are steroids. So when you think about hormones that we like, estrogen and testosterone and thyroid hormone, and like the one I showed you in lab, the thyroxine, and all of those things, they kind of have this setup of a structure. They have these things that are fused rings. And these can be really important in the body. So you can see these are 6 carbon fused rings, so these sort of hexo structures, and then we have this pentagon one on the end. So that's kind of a typical picture of a steroid. Where a wax has, they call them esters. They're just a little different, but you don't need to know these structures or chemical formulas. I just want you to have the general idea of these categories. Okay. These, however, you want to know, and these we'll spend even more time on than in this little lecture, but this is a category of lipids called phospholipids. Now, remember I promised there were a couple of other functional groups that you would be exposed to, and this is one of them. So the phosphate functional group is this one here, where you see a phosphorus atom and then surrounded and bonded to 4 oxygens. But it also has, some of those oxygen atoms can have charges on them. So this part here, and just think about the fact oxygen is there, is going to tell you that this is probably going to be a polar piece of this whole molecule. So here it is. Underneath it is our friend glycerol, the one we just looked at with the triglycerides. And so we see a glycerol. So this also likes water. So it has the alcohol groups on it, if you remember. This whole thing is called hydrophilic because this whole piece of this phospholipid interacts with water. Below it, though, it bonded to it are these tails again, these fatty acid tails, some of which can be straight, saturated, has maximum number of hydrogens, some of which might have a kink in them, generally at least one of them does, and that's unsaturated fatty acid. So this whole structure all together forms a unit called a phospholipid. I'm going to go. So on this, let's see if I can slide this thing up or down. I guess I just have to reduce the size just a little bit so you can see it all. These are just 3 different models. So this is the one we just looked at. This is called a space-filling model. It kind of looks like something a kid would construct, but it's meaning the same thing. It's just sort of showing you more of the atoms here. Oh, we get more music in the background. And now, this is typically what we write a lot when we're doing it, just the very easy shortcut version where we have this circle here representing that hydrophilic head, and then these things here representing hydrophobic tails. So this is a symbol we'll see a lot, much more frequently than either of those two. Now why they're so important is because they make this thing called the cell membrane. So this is a little piece of the cell membrane known as a phospholipid bilayer, because notice there's 2 layers. There's an upper one and there's a lower one, and they're facing the ones that like each other. The hydrophobic ends are all facing inward, away from any watery environment, so they're kind of hiding out in here. This kind of a molecule, a phospholipid, is called amphipathic. It just means that part of it is hydrophilic, the heads, and some of it is hydrophobic, the tails. Amphi, like amphibian. It's kind of like it has a dual life or dual nature, so amphipathic. Here's the steroids again. They don't like water either, because remember we're in this category of things which generally don't like water, lipids. And you can look at this in more detail or ask me questions about this later. So they're not strictly hydrocarbons. They have some other components on them. That's enough to see that. And then finally, we're into proteins, and this is its own lecture. So that's where I'll quit.